We're really lucky to have Nick DeVito here with us today. Nick is a postdoctoral researcher at the Bennett Institute for Applied Data Science at the University of Oxford, and he works on topics around health policy, transparency, research integrity, and open science. Nick completed his DPhil earlier this year at Oxford, and he was supervised by Ben Goldacre and Carl Heenahan. Before his DPhil, Nick worked at Columbia University, and he studied the impact of the Physician Payment Sunshine Act there. So today, Nick's going to talk about some of his work, particularly around transparency and accuracy of reporting in clinical trials, which is going to be drawing largely from his really impactful PhD work. So I'll hand over to Nick.
Hey everyone. Hi. Thanks, Stephen, and thanks for having me. It's really excited to always do reproducibilities. I ran one of these at Oxford for a bit, so it's always great to jump in. So let me just share my screen here, and then this. Okay. So yeah. No need to go through everything Stephen just said again, but I am Nick, and yeah, I'm a postdoc at Oxford. I have the Data Lab logo there, which is out of date, but that should be the Bennett Institute logo. And then that's my sort of main affiliation. And just a little bit more about me, mixed methods researcher with a public health and health policy background. And just anyone who gave some funding that sort of supported this work. It's the Naji Foundation, the Laura and John Arnold Foundation. These are all people who either supported parts of my thesis or the Trials Tracker project. So, hold on. I think I may have opened the wrong version of this talk. Give me one moment. It's titled correctly, but I think I may have grabbed the wrong one. 1 second. There we go. I'll just use this version. This is fine. Okay, sorry about that. Okay. Yes. Okay, great. So, my thesis is titled the same thing as this presentation, and I'm going to walk you through some of the, sort of what my research showed and what my aims for my thesis were and sort of what I ended up concluding at the end of it. So I like to start out with a little bit of background. I imagine seems like people are here from across the Leeds, community and might not necessarily work directly on clinical trials and things like that. So, in a very simplified way, these are all things that every clinical trial must have, pretty much, right? You have to have a protocol. If you don't, you're sort of doing a trial flying by the seat of your pants, and that's the seat of your pants, and that's not great. You should have a prospective registry entry, and you should have ethics approval. Then you do the study, obviously, and then you report the results. A very simplified schematic and framework about how clinical trials work. But even in the simplified model, we can say that there's probably a lot of issues with a lot of things going on here. So, are clinical trials being published? Well, no. If we look at the most recent systematic review on that matter, meta-analysis, they think about 50% of all trials are published when you go collecting studies that have looked at whether trials that we know about have gone on to make publications available. When we do get results, are they any good? Well, when we look at the way things like Consort as sort of a proxy for good reporting quality work, turns out probably not improving, but not great still, and unreliable compared to pre-specification specifically, which is leaves obviously lots of room for bias. And then once again, if the results we have aren't any good, and then are the methods any good? And even that we can't tell, which ties into the Consort stuff I was talking about. But we need access to more and better information to be sure that the trials that go to inform our clinical decision-making at all levels is sort of correct. And without a complete and accurate accounting of a trial and its results, we cannot do that. So I like to give this example where you have from Eric Turner, who's an American. He used to be a reviewer at the FDA. And so he's knows how to get data out of the FDA that isn't necessarily easily attainable, but via various public records requests, you can get access. So basically, he looked at, in 2008, he looked at all 12 antidepressants on the market, and he found that there were, that the FDA, who does independent reevaluation of any studies that are submitted to them. So if you want your drug approved and you submit to the FDA, then you have to submit the raw data, and then independent biostatisticians will redo the analyses and make their own independent evaluation of efficacy and safety, which is something I believe no other regulatory agency in the world does. But he looked at what the FDA said, and they said, okay, for these 12 antidepressants, there were 38 positive and 36 negative results. So what happens if we look for those same studies in the literature? Well, then we have 48 positive results and 3 negative results, and then a bunch of missing results. So we're seeing both sort of spin, so a bias in reporting, and a bias and a publication bias as well, where we're only seeing positive results despite independent reevaluation saying that there should be about half and half. This was updated recently in 2022. They looked at 4 additional antidepressants that have entered the market since that initial study. Once again, about a 50-50 split between the FDA's assessment of positive and negative results. And when you look at it, and while not as quite as bad as before, at the very least, you have all 30 studies getting out there. There's still a spin in interpretation of what those studies actually said. Because obviously the publication is beholden to the investigators, who are beholden to the pharmaceutical companies. So there's a COI there, and there's a lot of incentive for those results to come out positive. So maybe this all doesn't quite, we don't quite know what's going on at any steps here for a lot of studies that are out there in the world. I don't want to be too dim. I don't think it's like this across the board, but I think there's a lot of questions into the extent to which there's issues here. So can you access a protocol if there is one, but you can't access it? What does that do for transparency? Was it a registry entry perspective? Same with a protocol. Can you get your hands on a perspective one? Ethics, which is a thing everyone needs to do. Are they involved in the process of making sure those things happen? Do they even care? Sometimes it's really difficult to even find out if a study even happened without tracing down people on email and literally just asking them. Were the methods any good? Was this study reported at all? Do I have to go on a wild goose chase to find it, or is it properly indexed with something like the registry entry ID, available in a searchable way? And is it fully reported? Did they report all their outcomes? Did they do things with their analysis plan to muck up the reporting? So these are all things that that we need to think about in the overall clinical trial infrastructure. So people have been thinking about this for a long time. Robert John Symes is an Australian epidemiologist and or biostatistician, something like that. But he's Australian, I know that much. And he was writing about this in 1986, kind of showing, hey, if we take a bunch of cancer trials we know about, and then we only look into literature, we can see that there's a bias towards positive findings that make these things look more effective, and they go away if we take a bunch of results that weren't in the literature but that we know about due to an early U.S. government registry for this sorts of data. And he says one way to handle this would be for an international clinical trial registration network platform, something along those lines, so that we know what's out there. You're sort of putting a stake in the ground and declaring and saying, I am doing this trial, and please expect results something like in 2 years, in a year. And this is what I'm planning to do. And you can hold me to that, since I declared that I was doing it before the study started. So we have that network now, right? Like 30, 40 years later, we have that network. It was sort of built up very much in the early 2000s, which I'll get to in a minute. But this is what it looks like. There's like 16, 17 registries or networks of registries spread across the globe, many focused on a single country. Some sort of, but most also accepting registrations from other places. ClinicalTrials.gov being the largest of these by far, by like an order of magnitude. It's got something like nearly 500,000 registrations of trials and observational research in it. The EU Clinical Trial Register, which is now being phased out and replaced by the CTIS system in Europe, is also big. That's pan-European for all interventional drug, vaccine, and biological research. So yeah, and these vary quite substantially in their quality, in my opinion, and we'll can talk a little bit about that more potentially later on, and how reliable the data in them is. But they've all sort of met some minimum standard as accredited by the ICTRP, which is the International Clinical Trial Registries platform, which is managed within the WHO. And they're doing stuff, they're still active, though severely understaffed, but they're, for instance, taking consultation at the moment to update their standards to synthesize what all registries should have for results when people report results to the registry, what that should look like, because that varies considerably in the capability of all these registries to accept results at the moment. So this is just, the individual things here are a lot less important. But the colors sort of group, and you can see who was acting when to sort of make this all happen with the development of the clinical trial registry system and how it really took off starting in the early 2000s. And you can see that there was sort of push at the national and multinational body level, sort of combined with regulatory and legal and academic things like the ICMJE, who's the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, which really is influential in the biomedical space. And they sort of, in 2004, declared that they wouldn't publish things that aren't prospectively registered moving forward, which was hugely influential. But just to sort of compact and minimize this all a bit, what we basically had is we had years of people, 2 decades of people sort of shouting and saying why we need this and pointing out all the problems and how much of a threat to evidence-based medicine it was. And then we had a big scandal, which is that New York versus GSK, which just very briefly was the paroxetine scandal, which some people might be familiar with. Paroxetine is an antidepressant, and it was given off-label to children, teenagers, and people people, minors. And what the company that is now GSK was found to have suppressed evidence showing that giving it to minors actually increased the risk of suicide. And that was a huge scandal here in the UK, and in the US, GSK was fined billions of dollars for it in the US. And then that sort of was the inciting incident that led to a lot of this, subsequent action in the global registry landscape and the overall way we care about why and how trials are reported a lot more than we used to. This is just showing that point. So 2004, I said, is sort of the year everything changed, and the year ICMJE put down their ultimatum to say if you want to end up in Lancet or NEJM or JAMA, you need a prospective registration. And you can see that it shoots up like a rocket, the total registrations globally on the ICTRP platform. ICTRP takes data from all of those individual registries I showed before and sort of aggregates a minimum data set into their own sort of meta platform. So this is looking across the globe. So the question I was sort of getting at in my thesis is this system functioning optimally? And with a specific focus on how registry entries can inform better, making sure that the conduct of a study was good and that those studies are eventually reported. And that is really the niche focus of my thesis. So how are registries being used? For the first study I'm going to talk about, not the compare study, but I just wanted to give a little introduction based on the compare study. That was sort of my influence here. This was a study run by my advisor, Ben Goldacre, my colleague, Henry Drysdale. And basically they said, okay, we know reporting bias is a problem. We know that people often will switch or change outcomes and not declare that they did so. It's fine if you need to change something, you just need to say that you did and ideally why. So they went to the big 5 medical journals, JAMA, NEJM, BMJ, Annals, and Lancet. And they looked at all the trials that showed up in those journals over, I think it was a month. and they tried to find a pre-registered some sort of protocol that was prospective. They couldn't find that. They used the registry entry. And what they found was that there were massive amounts of outcome reporting bias, which we kind of already knew. And then the added part was that they tried to send letters to the journal saying, hey, you endorse Consort, you claim to care about these things. This is an issue we found. And the journals, some published them, some sort of show up automatically, like on BMJ, even though I don't really publish that many trials. And others really pushed back on this. Annals of Internal Medicine, not a fan of this. And really like push back and say things can change and blah, 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 almost incoherently. But that was sort of an inspiration to look at something similar on a little bit of a smaller scale for my thesis, to sort of prove the point and prove the worth of registries being able to serve this function of a way to check outcomes. So I looked at this in e-cigarette reporting. Some of our other work on the FDA, the FDA trials tracker, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, I saw that there was a little population of trials that were sponsored by Juul Labs, which is obviously a big maker of e-cigarettes. And I said, and they looked like they weren't reported, or they weren't reported in full. So I said, I want to look at this more in depth, a little bit more fully, unpack this a bit more. So I grabbed those, ended up being 5 studies, met the inclusion criteria, and I looked for them on clinicaltrials.gov, in the literature, and there's a Juul repository of sort of the research they fund. So, and I compared the registered outcomes to the results. And I found that, 1 to 2 years on from a lot of these studies ending, we weren't seeing the pre-specified outcomes, but all of these studies were going to be included in regulatory submissions to the FDA in the United States. The e-cigarette research is a bit of a Wild West area, tobacco research regulation in general, and how it relates, like, are these things medicinal products if they're helping you stop smoking, or are they regulated separately? Do they need to report results under the law? So it looked like it was when I did this study, and then it turned out that Juul thinks not, and they changed some things in the registry entry to make it look like they aren't. I don't think that's quite as cut and dry, but there's probably no right answer until someone like the FDA weighs in. But anyway, lots of outcomes were missing. There was stuff in conference apps posters, but that was all very limited reporting and kind of weird, inconsistent reporting that I point out in the piece. And, after we published this, Juul posted a comment saying, hey, we published 2 more of these, which I'm happy to give them credit for. The 2 highlighted in red are now published. They have journal articles. I haven't gone back and sort of reassessed them yet to check the outcome reporting. But the outcome reporting was there for the one we did find already at that time, and we sort of pointed out, and that the quote there is from me in our response to Juul, saying, you really ignored this, and hey, why didn't you report these to clinicaltrials.gov? That's sort of an open, rapid way to get your results out there completely, and you don't really have to worry about future journal publication because it shouldn't preclude that. Why don't you just use the registry? And they never responded. So yeah, the registry is sort of being ignored as a dissemination method is sort of the interesting takeaway here, in addition to the reporting bias. Another study that sort of ends up having the same means to the same end, the same point, is I got involved in some this direct study. I sort of run this study with colleagues from Germany, and we wanted to sort of look at how rapidly results of registered COVID clinical trials are entering the literature. And, we're working on our final analysis now, which is of over 2,600 interventional COVID trials. So it was a lot of work, but we had some preliminary results, which is what I detail in my thesis, looking at the trials completed through the first 6 months. So you saw about, when you give a minimum follow-up of about 3 months, about 20% stuff get out there. And the whole idea is that we wanted to sort of understand when rapid dissemination matters a lot, how quickly are things getting out there. And we looked at, preprint registries and journal articles. And I think the main takeaway for this talk is that registries were not being used as a method for rapid dissemination, despite being potentially the most rapid way you could have your results enter the world. This is preliminary data from our full analysis, and where results ended up for the trials we found results. By the time we handled cross registrations and exclusions and everything, we were at around 15, just under 1,600 trials, and about 400 of those had results. And still we had no very low registry usage. Some other fun results from this were, you can see that there was slightly more rapid reporting in the first third of the pandemic, if you kind of split into thirds over those first 18 months, while the subsequent 2/3. So people were trying to get stuff out really quick early on. And just once again, comparing what dissemination looked like from very early on in the pandemic to a much longer term follow-up. You can see journal articles went from being less than preprints to far more likely to be published than a preprint. That was a shift over the course of the pandemic. This is just showing, this is just a Kaplan-Meier curve showing time from primary completion to reporting for the 3 registries, which really have like a good mechanism for you to report your results, and it's just abysmal. Over 1,100 trials registered on these registries, and reporting showing up under 10% of the time at the longest term follow-up. And you saw a lot of this. You see a lot of trials that were registered early on, so registered April 7th, last updated April 8th, and then just abandoned. Favipiravir was a treatment that got a decent amount of attention early on in the pandemic, and knowing whether it worked or not would have been useful. So what happened to that study? We don't know. So the next part, so after kind of showing these issues with data quality and registries and how we can use registries, but also some of the problems in using registries, what about the regulations we use to look at these? So the FDA Trial Tracker is a thing I run where we just basically look at all the trials that we look like they're covered under the law on clinicaltrials.gov and see whether they reported. They have to report within a year of their primary completion date, and we wanted to see how often that happens. This was my first paper out of my DPhil, was in the Lancet, and it was sort of looking at this from when the new rules around this reporting came into effect in early 2018 through late 2019, so sort of September 2019, and sort of taking what we do with the trials tracker and then looking at it longitudinally. And what you can see is that reporting rates on time, so meeting that 1-year deadline, are very low, and they're not getting better. That flat blue line is the proportion of all trials that are reported on time. And ideally, as people get better and aware of the law, that would be creeping up, and as more and more people report on time. But that's not happening. It's sort of a steady rate of around 40% report on time, while late results continue to trickle in, and then that red line slowly creeps up over time, and the green bars represent overdue trials that haven't reported at that point. So you'll see that's creeping up as well. So sort of, you're not gaining anything in more rapid results dissemination. And when we look at that applied over a longer time frame, I reran this analysis just to have some updated numbers for comparison through June of last year when I was writing that chapter of my thesis. And you can see pretty much the same trend with only minor blips in improvement here and there, but pretty much people still aren't getting results in when they're supposed to. There's a lot of late reporting going on. But that isn't to say that the regulation is sort of for naught. You can see a distinct, absolutely distinct trend here in the behavior of sponsors in relation to that 1-year deadline. It's perhaps not as steep of a drop as we would like, but quite a steep drop, people getting stuff in right before that 1-year deadline from primary completion. So having a deadline clearly does have an impact. It would probably be much worse if that deadline wasn't imposed. I then extended, so the sort of saying, hey, we looked at that at scale. Can we look at other things at scale? Sort of in the cross-whole data set, what can we automate in terms of checking compliance with different aspects of the law and its implementation? And I ended up implementing timely registration, whether people are updating their data once annually, which they're supposed to do, whether they're requesting delays to reporting, which you're allowed to do under certain circumstances, but you have to do it in a timely manner. People were doing that only about 2/3 of the time. And then whether people are making, alongside their results, they have to make their protocol and statistical analysis plan available. And that happened, but it happened almost all the time, but only in instances where you had results. So if you don't have results, you usually don't have a statistical analysis plan or a protocol available. So the FDA has sort of, started taking this a bit more seriously. They are now sending some letters to non-compliant sponsors, but that seems a bit all over the place, and there's no rhyme or reason to it. And they've only done it to 4, and as those numbers are actually a bit old for the version of this presentation I'm using, but you can see it's not changed. There are potentially thousands of unreported trials. So sending 4 letters, while might have a knock-on effect of causing some other sponsors to shape up, it's really not cutting the mustard for what you might want to see from a regulator who's in charge of making sure people report their trials. We do this for the EU as well. This number's, I think, 84.6% now as of this month. Basically, there's EU rules that said you have to, anyone who conducted a trial, an interventional drug trial since 2004, basically has to go back and report the results or report it moving forward, and we check that. So that's gotten much better over time. When we first did our analysis on this back in 2018, it was like under 50%, I believe. Using data from January 2018, it was 49%. So huge, massive increases here. And a lot of that is because people paid attention to our findings in our tracker here. The House of Commons Science and Technology Committee came out and took notice of our results and ended up sending letters to all the sort of universities and NHS trusts in the country, saying you should really do this. This is pre-Brexit, so they were still beholden to EU reporting rules at the time. And then, that really caused a big stir. And you can see it in the numbers. It's really striking. So between January 2018, when we did that first analysis, and July 2022, here's what we call a major sponsor in the UK, which is anyone who had over 50 trials registered on the registry. And you can see massive changes in how much of the results were reported. And I've done some other analysis showing that the data quality on the registry from the UK is also quite a bit better, which we'll touch on briefly in a moment. And I talked to people too. This was the last part of my thesis, is sort of what does this look like on the ground. And I'm not going to talk about this too much or read any of these quotes. But people can pause, the video here if they're interested. I'm in the process of condensing this down into something for publication. But basically, people took notice when the Science and Technology Committee took notice, and that absolutely drew attention to the issue amongst these non-commercial sponsors in the UK. This is what a record looks like on the EUCTR, and so once we sort of showed that this reporting was an issue, but there were but getting better, but there were still some potential holes. I wanted to really quantify some of those holes a bit more. So when you have results on the EUCTR in a tabular format, it tells you exactly who in what countries had enrollment in the trial. And so I went and I said, okay, well, that should match up with what the trial protocols that are available on the EUCTR. So you can see AT and DE, that's Austria and Germany, and that matches up Austria, Germany, and Israel, which isn't beholden to wouldn't be on here because it's not Europe. So I compared those to the stuff that are the registered protocols for a trial, country level protocols, and what shows up in the results. And you can see that some countries really stood out as having a massive discrepancy. So where did those protocols go? Why can't we see them? Those were France, Poland, Romania, and Norway were really the worst at this. I did some other things. I looked at results reporting, naive to any sort of completion date for that other study I talked about. We used really conservative definitions of completed for the EU's trials tracker and things like that. But here you can just see that sort of reporting. There's some very old trials that still remain unreported. So, right, we're only at about 55% for all trials that were registered in 2004 originally. And that's really a problem over time. Much better reporting on multi-protocol trials, meaning they took place in multiple countries, which is a pretty good analog for industry. reporting compared to non-industry reporting, which is like these single protocol trials. That's not a perfect one-to-one, but it matches up pretty well, and that matches up with what we found in the US registry as well as when we did that original study on the EU registry, is that industry is much better reporting and following these rules than academia. I also wanted to see, I'm going to speed through this because I'm butting up against my time, but just basically, hey, how good useful is the EU CTR? And I found that people reported results to the EU CTR about as often as they report results in the literature from a sample of 500 trials taken from the EU CTR, and that of the results you find, about 20% of them are unique to the EU CTR, that you couldn't find them anywhere else if you looked. This is just showing where results were found, but I will go do that. And we just, Ben and I, we distilled that down about how if we want these regulations to be effective, they need to be enforced. We can't just be slapshod saying, oh, you have to report now, then patting ourselves on the back. There needs to be sort of active and robust mechanisms in place to ensure that this is happening. There needs to be routine audits to identify when things are going wrong or when people are slacking. And I think our work has really shown the viability of doing this. It doesn't take that much. We've been running on a shoestring budget for quite a while now to keep these going, but we've been able to do it. There's no reason why a regulator like the FDA or the EMA couldn't do this as well, or country level competent authorities in Europe as well, to sort of, and as we transition to the new European clinical trials law, they are more empowered to do that than they were before, and we're hoping that we might be able to see that. And they're being pressured to take this seriously from groups like Transparamed and Till Bruckner of Transparamed and all their allies, his allies, sort of in the advocacy world throughout Europe, including Cochrane, who has taken an interest in sort of promoting, as you might imagine, better reporting. So in conclusion, I think registries are a great resource for transparency and accountability. I know I paint a decently grim picture here, but you also have to remember that basically nothing I did in my thesis would be possible if this infrastructure didn't exist, and being able to do it is very powerful in and of itself. But I'd argue that stakeholders across the spectrum are not sort of using them as intended or to their full capacity. Editors aren't checking them, peer reviewers aren't checking them. How much research institutions care about and handle is widely differential in how much they regulate, how much you use the registries, how much support they give you in making sure you're registered and following the rules varies widely. There's a lot of neglect in the global registry system outside of the clinicaltrials.gov, and how those registries are maintained and how much people care about that they are, or if they are maintained and the data on them is accurate. And of course, I'm not saying that registries are the cure-all. I think they're one tool in the toolbox to fix all this up and make it better, aside various other systematic changes to the way we do report and reward research. And if you read anything Stephen's written, you can see how massive the problems are across the board, not just clinical trial registries. But I do really believe that they are a force for good, but one that needs to be sort of reinvigorated and reinvested in. And that's it for me. Thank you very much.